no results are ever immediate. And there was a lot of trial and error. But after, somewhere between 6 and 8 months, I was like, oh, this is starting to work. I'm more motivated, I'm more consistent, I'm better, I'm a better trainer, my body's starting to feel better, my mind feels clear, I've got a vision of where I want.
Hello, welcome. My name is Doug Gordon. I'm host of the show, Inspirational People, Inspirational Stories. The aim of the show is to interview inspiring people who've either been successful in their field or inspired others to success in some form. Today's guest is Irish rugby legend Andrew Conway. Renowned for his electric pace, clinical finishing, Andrew thrilled fans for over a decade with standout performances for both Munster and Ireland. From Six Nations glory to unforgettable tries, he's been at the heart of some of Ireland's greatest rugby moments. Now, retired from professional sport, Andrew has seamlessly transitioned into a new chapter as the founder of a high-performance consultancy, one that focuses on helping individuals and teams tap into their elusive and powerful flow state. Drawing on his elite level experience, he brings the mindset, focus, and discipline of world-class sport to the world of businesses, performance, and personal growth. Having spent an afternoon with him, I have to say he really is a true inspiration and an absolute pleasure to have on the show. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate the kind words.
Well, I have to say, I am so grateful that we met and had that time together in the Westbury, which is always good to hang around with cool people, including yourself. And your world of knowledge outside of sport, as much as inside of sport, is going to help so many people. And I just thought you'd be such a brilliant guest to inspire and help some of those entrepreneurs out there and business people out there, as well as the sports people. Obviously, an amazing career in what you've done in terms of rugby and one of absolute rugby legends. I'd love to know, I'm sure a lot of other people would love to know, what inspired you to pursue rugby at such a high level and what kept you motivated for all those years?
Yeah, listen, I suppose it goes back all the way to whenever you first start playing sports when you're a young lad. Predominantly, I played soccer to start, and then I went to Blackrock College, where rugby is big. And I get asked that a bit, and probably the question seems to revolve around when did you realize you could make a career out of it. I don't have there's no eureka moment. There's never any guarantees, particularly with sport. It's such a competitive landscape, and you're obviously only one injury away from losing momentum at an early age. So I suppose I see my kind of sporting journey as two parts: the pre-Munster and the post, or not post-Munster, but pre-Munster and then Munster. And Munster just gave me a second chance. I was talented. I was always pretty talented. Growing up, playing underage teams and representative teams, but I was nowhere near the appropriate level of, mental fitness, the emotional resilience that, you hear a lot about these days. And I was kind of thrown in the deep end as an 18-year-old and, very nearly didn't work out. It was a close one, and people that would have been around me at the time and myself would, there was reasons for that. There was, I was very connected to, a strong group of school friends that, they were going in and living the college life. And I was trying to be both professional rugby player and live the college lifestyle without actually being in college. And it took me a few years to realize that those things don't align, and maybe they do for the very odd person, but they certainly didn't for me. And made a big decision at 21 to leave Leinster, who were on the up at the time, and go down to Munster, who I had a family affiliation with anyway through my uncle, and going to the Munster matches when I was young with a school friend whose family from Cork, and that gave me a huge resurgence. Personally, I was out of the comfort of my own home. Learning to cook, learning to clean, learning to fend for myself, which was just so important. I was 22, so I wasn't old, but I needed that. And I suppose to answer your question, what gave me the motivation, it was those early experiences, in Leinster, and it was this is all total ownership on my behalf. It was actually nothing external that was holding me back. It was all internal. And that experience and the near miss of nearly throwing it all away was the motivation for the following 10, 11 years that, no matter what happened, I wasn't going to die wondering, and I was going to give everything, and whatever that looked like in terms of where I ended up and the performances I got to, I was at peace with that, but as long as I held up my end of the bargain, and I feel like I did that.
Yeah. And obviously fantastic. I mean, I think it was 250 points for Munster and 45 points for Ireland, and many fantastic performances as well. As a sportsman myself, I have to say I was at Loughborough University with Johnny Bell, who used to play for Ireland as well. And he did enjoy himself, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember Gregor Townsend down, both of them from Northampton, down in the student union bar, seemed to be very much enjoying themselves. But I think that was 30 years ago, and times have kind of changed a bit now as well.
Yeah, but I suppose I don't want to make it sound like it went from all partying to no partying. Rugby's got a real good balance. To be fair, it does. There's beers in the change room after. There's nights out throughout the season. Pre-season there'll always be a Christmas party. There'll always be a big kind of pre-season bash. So they do have the balance right. But I suppose my experience was I was way far on this side, and but you live and you learn. I was thrown into it at 18, and I was a young 18 as well, so a lot of learnings were ahead of me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all very much appreciated that Johnny was like that, because I think he was one of the first paid professionals back in the day. So he spent his money on parties for all of us, which was
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah, yeah.
But obviously, moving on. So you had some fantastic performances, both for Munster and Ireland. One of the things, as a sportsman myself, I used to have my little rituals and things I used to do before I got on the hockey pitch. I'd love to know, tell us a little bit about your own personal pre-game rituals. And did you have some kind of system to get into what you call now your flow state before matches?
Yes and no. It's. I suppose if you look at the landscape of a full career, it's never going to be the same from the start from the start to how it finishes. I suppose if I look back and I can pick out one thing that was a needle mover for me on game day, it was meditating.
Mm.
And 20 minutes of meditation, whether that was guided meditation from a lady that I've worked with over the past called Susan Quirk, who's amazing, or just a meditation practice of just saying a mantra in your head. That seemed to be a real big change for me. Particularly in consistency. It was that was something that I was able to kind of create a bit of a point of difference for myself. That my consistency started to become at a very high level, and that comes from the work you do. That comes from experience. It comes from the work you do over time. But it also, in my experience, comes from little small things that make a difference to the individual. That's not to say that a meditation is the answer for everyone, or it's a silver bullet, but it worked for me, and it just grounded me, gave me a sense of peace, and it gave me a sense of presence that when I wasn't doing it, I maybe didn't have.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I interviewed Jamie Heaslip and Stuart Lancaster, and they said the same thing. They said by meditating, you can put yourself in the energy of the game and visualize the game to kind of, work out what you want to do, but also relax the central nervous system as well. So I absolutely love that. And obviously, interlinked to that, when you were at your best on the field, is there anything that was, potentially that people can learn from that was going on mentally, emotionally, or physically to perform at that level?
When I was at my best, I suppose if I look back and kind of piece together personally my top performances, whether that was, top two or three or four in a season or over a career, I tended to play at my highest level whenever the stakes were highest. And that's not to say that I always played my best when the stakes were highest. I had a few poor games when the stakes were high. But generally, and there's a thing in what I'm doing now in terms of flow, it's called the Goldilocks zone. And the Goldilocks zone is whenever the perception of your skills is going to be stretched in the event that you're about to come into, or the match in my case. And that that's an intrinsic thing, and what comes up with that perceived stretching of skills, doubt comes into it. That the term imposter syndrome, which is poorly worded in my opinion, but that kind of feeling of am I going to be able to hang here? And for some people that destroys them. It really badly affects them. But for me, for whatever reason, that was something that was a kind of thread line in my career that brought the best out of me. But also the opposite was true. Whenever I was going into matches thinking, I remember playing France in Paris in Stade de France. I can't remember what year it was, but I remember walking into the stadium and being like, I own this place. I just had this unbelievable confidence and I had no doubt about it, but I played absolutely shite, Yeah. But for someone else, well, one of my good pals, Simon Zebo, he needed to feel like he owned the place to produce those top class performances. But my kind of my process was a bit different.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting you mentioned about imposter syndrome. I interviewed another guy called Jack Daly, who's an international best-selling author, all about sales. He spoke at the Pendulum Summit here in Ireland, and he was saying to me that he's 76, and even now, sometimes he has a trophy room, which I told him sounded a bit ego, but actually he said, no, Doug, it's not ego. It's because even at doing this for 30 years, I sometimes need to walk in there, get into the energy, and remind myself that I'm actually good enough to help these people.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's very much interlinked as well.
Yeah, for sure. But I think the things like imposter syndrome or, doubt, I think they're strong emotions as well. If you look at it right and you have an experience of, let's call it the imposter syndrome for want of a better term, um, and you take it for what it is, the emotion or the experience you're feeling pre an event or a meeting or a match, but then you also incorporate the outcome of said event, meeting, or match, and you start piecing the data together. For a lot of people, that imposter syndrome will lead to high levels of performance because they feel like they have to, they're on it. They're really like it opens up a hyper level of focus because you feel like you have to. So in my opinion, all those things when you start unpacking them and intertwining them and putting them together, if you take the time to do it, you start understanding yourself a bit more, and that kind of know thyself piece, I think, is one of the biggest differences that people have that are consistent top performers in any walk of life.
Yeah, I agree. And it kind of keeps you humble as well, which is good, which is a good sign of leadership as well. In terms of leadership, what did you witness or experience in great teams like Munster or Ireland that you could now take on to what you're doing now?
I suppose I was very fortunate to work alongside some unbelievably good players, world class players, over different generations. That's the first thing, and you look at them, whether you're consciously or subconsciously doing it, you're seeing standards that they're holding themselves to on a daily basis. I think that just, that's contagious, and that's the benefit of getting exposed to top level athletes over a lot consistently. That's it is such huge benefit in that. And then the coaches, the coaches I've worked with are just, some of the best that the game has ever produced and will ever produce, from Razzie Erasmus, Andy Farrell, Joe Schmidt, into Felix Jones, Jerry Flannery, Paul O'Connell. And I know a few of those guys are players, the last three, but then they've moved into coaching now, and they're just really good human beings. And they're not perfect, of course. It's not about that, but they care about what they're doing, and they care about the people they're doing it with. Particularly those last three I mentioned, Paulie, Felix, and Jerry. Felix is someone who he didn't mentor me, but I try to mirror him in terms of his output, his professionalism, his effort levels. Jerry was someone who thought really differently, and myself and himself had a great relationship because I took from him that anything was possible if you believe it and if you put the work in and you align those two things. And Paulie was a great thinking man, probably a combination of Jerry and Felix, where the standards he held for himself first and foremost were just the highest of the highs, and then the standard he expected from those around him, but in a really good way. You don't want to cross him for sure, but he just had an amazing ability to lead people, and you wanted to put your body on the line. You wanted to show up in the morning and give 10 out of 10 effort when you're around people like that. And I feel very, very blessed that I was fortunate enough to be in those rooms for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. And did so well as well. And I met when we met, obviously you're still in top condition. But obviously, unfortunately, as everybody knows, you had to retire early due to injury. Can you run us through the experience of having the injury and having to retire, how it felt and how you process it effectively?
Yeah. So I suppose I take it back before I retired for the 18 kind of 20 months leading into the retirement. I was getting operations, I was rehabbing, I was getting close to being back. I was then having a setback, but then going for another operation, and all the while missing Grand Slams, championship winning Six Nations, World Cups, so that was really hard at times. I suppose the more an important piece to throw into that mix is that the same time as my kind of knee injury first appeared was in the same month that my first child was born. Um, so although that was hard, there was something so magical going on at home, and it really did wonders from my perspective, because when you have your first child, and we've two now, it kind of goes to show you that of course sport matters, and I want to be successful, and I wanted to, would have loved to have been still playing and have my kids on the pitch after games and have create more memories and achieve more in the game. But ultimately, it's a very small part of it when you experience what it's like to have children. And to have her Haley arrive at that time, like I said, it wasn't easy because I was, fighting against my body, pretty much every day, and it was, wasn't playing ball, but also was very different to an experience of if we take it back 5 years and I was, 26, 27, years and years still away from kids, hadn't achieved what I set out to in terms of, reaching my potential or getting around my potential and playing to that high level where I always felt I could hang. That's a very different set of circumstances to my one, where I was a professional since I was 18, retired at 32. So it's 14 years. I think the average professional career in Ireland is either somewhere between 6 and 8 years, so over double that. So the way my mind works is I don't really tend to look back, and, of course I would have loved more caps for Ireland, would have loved more medals, more trophies, more special days, and I absolutely would have loved to be playing when the kids, like you kind of still get jealous when you see big match, big win, and the kids jumping out in the pitch after. I never got that properly. But listen, I suppose the mindset that I have is I look back on it and I rarely ever, if ever, think about, what could have been. I kind of more look at, the happy parts of it. And I think that's just, how I've probably trained my mind to perceive, and um, and it's very, very helpful.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, as a dad myself with a 19-year-old boy in Trinity playing rugby and a 17-year-old girl, it flies by. So enjoy every moment with your beautiful
Yeah,
kids. And
yeah,
I
thank you.
I know what it's like as a dad, and they look
Yeah,
lovely, by the way. You got a lovely family.
thank you.
Um, I know, obviously, having retired, I know a lot of athletes in any sport, including myself, when I left hockey, struggle with the emotional crash out of stepping out that sense of purpose every week. Did you face any moments of self-doubt and loss of identity yourself?
I don't know if loss of identity is the right term. I suppose I'm about 18 months retired now. I've had probably 16 beautiful months. I've had one really, really hard month and a few weeks scattered within that block of time that have been tough. And I don't have the answer for you because I don't know exactly what it is. I suppose it was 6 months. That really hard month was 6 months post retiring, and I've been warned about this infamous 6 month mark by a few guys who I've already mentioned. And even to the point where, I was a few days shy of the 6 month. And because I'd been told it by more than one person, you take it seriously. I remember saying to my wife, probably a week before this, in and around 6 months, going, there's no way 6 months, this thing is going to affect me. Maybe that was just them for whatever reason. And almost to the day, I went from the kind of honeymoon period post retiring, where you're making plans for what's next. You're able to go travel a bit during the year. You're enjoying Christmas. So I retired in November, and it was actually May. May was very tough for me, the following May. And I suppose the reality of you don't get to, you now don't have the opportunity to express yourself in a really fundamental way and be paid for it. I think it's a combination of a few things. I don't think my identity was tied to the sport, which, if I try and unpack that, I bring you back to what I said at the start. Whenever I moved to Munster, I had to do a huge unpacking then, because my career was, kind of slowly going down. And that was a big body of work that I did to really be honest with myself and see, be accountable to myself, essentially. And I think, without knowing for sure, I think that really helped me in retired life, because I'd already gone through a huge transition, even though no one really would have known it at the time, other than the people really close to me. That was a huge transition for me. I changed a lot. I changed a lot about myself because I needed to. And, I think my identity is a bit more wrapped up in that. And obviously then you have kids and you're trying to plan for what's next. And, for me, I feel I'm quite self-aware, and I know what makes me tick. And I also know what gives me energy. And crucially, I know what takes energy from me. And it's really important for me to plan for the next 10 years, or so, and trust myself to go into something that, if I had to hang it on one question, it was, whatever I do next has to feed me energy, because I know I can get really, really good at it if energy has been fed to me because I care about it.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm doing it for the wrong reasons, one, I'm going to be useless at it, and two, it's going to be an energy taker, and ultimately it's likely going to be a failure. So they're kind of questions that guided me, and I suppose helped me give me a bit of clarity when I needed it.
Yeah, do you know what? I'm intrigued because you probably think there are things that were so small it doesn't really matter. But I'd love to know, what were the kind of changes you made mentally, physically, emotionally, or whatever it was, that turned you from a career going down like this, before joining Munster, to then something that projected you all the way up to the Irish team?
Oh, a lot. First thing jumped out is lifestyle. You know, Maybe shouldn't say this on a podcast, but used to love a fag, used to love a cigarette. Um, and that stemmed from just being one of the lads in school and all that. Um, and loads of people do that when they're young, but very few of them are professional athletes. And I didn't have the maturity to realize that this kind of behavior was hurting me. I kind of was, if you throw the word identity in there to try and explain some of that behavior, my identity was still connected to, being one of the lads out on a Saturday night, drinking, smoking, getting in argy bargies, that type of thing. Which all my, that was kind of just, you're growing up, but I hadn't put together that I had a different responsibility, to myself first and foremost, but then to Leinster and my family in Everton. So lifestyle was a big one. Kind of the holistic approach to the game. I was always a hard trainer. When I was on the pitch, I'd work as hard as I could. I was in the gym, I'd work as hard as I could. But once I was out of those two places where the work was required, I signed off. You know what I mean? I was going over to the lad's house until, again, I'm 20, I'm 19, 20, 21 here. So, the the lifestyle is probably not going to be as good as it's going to be to, a 30-year-old with a couple of kids. But mine was just, I'm kind of all or nothing. That's my mindset, and there's strengths to that, but there's also weaknesses to that. So you'd be over and chilling in the lad's house till 11, 12, watching movies, and then, going home into bed for 1 o'clock and getting up the next morning for training. Whereas you fast forward 6, 7, 8 years, or even 2 years after this kind of shift, that block away from the building, they just look so different. They were just so unrecognizable. And I started to understand that if I commit to this and I trust that consistency over time, this will start stacking and compounding. And that will be a game changer in terms of performance. And I started to see that within probably about 6 months, maybe, of starting the work. No results are ever immediate, and there was a lot of trial and error. But after somewhere between 6 and 8 months, I was like, oh, this is starting to work. I'm more motivated. I'm more consistent. I'm better. I'm a better trainer. My body's starting to feel better. My mind feels clear. I've got a vision of where I want to go now, as opposed to just doing it for doing its sake.
Yeah, it's amazing that they often say don't sweat the small stuff, but actually the small stuff adds up to great habits that can lead to much better performance. So absolutely love that. And in terms of performance, you've obviously set up now a performance consultancy. You could have done anything. You're a great communicator, so you could have been pundit, whatever, and yet you went down the performance consultancy route to help people focus on reaching that flow state. What inspired you towards that direction?
I suppose, it took a bit of time, on the advice of some of the people I've already mentioned, said, if you can, take some time to just, let the dust settle, enjoy your family, whatever else, just, don't make decisions quickly if you don't have to. I think that's where the identity piece comes in. If your identity, or whatever term you want to put to that, is solely connected to an external title, then I think that what the guys were getting at were, don't worry about that, because what happens is when you retire, everyone, and no one means this in a bad way, or very few people at least, you meet people in the street, or your mates, or whoever it is, predominantly people in the street, really, particularly in Limerick. It's a small place. And so a lot of people, I know a lot of people there, whether I know them personally or just passing by in, different areas. And you get asked 20 times a week, if not more, talk about the retirement, and then what are you doing next? What are you doing next? What are you doing next? And to be fair, the lads have prepared me for this. So, you get a bit more, you want to be comfortable with saying, I'm just taking my time. I'm seeing what's, I'm figuring out what's next. But if you're not prepared for that, I think, and because you get different reactions whenever you say, some people, I'm taking my time, they're like, oh, really? People, for whatever reason, it's just human interaction, there's no malice in it, of course, but that can enter your system. That can be like, oh, Jesus, did he feel like I should be doing something? I'm retired 2 months now. Should I be doing something? You know what I mean? And it becomes this thing. So took that advice, even though it wasn't easy, because you have loads of those conversations with people. And as time went on, you obviously get a bit, I want to figure out what's next. But I always, like, my context, I suppose, has driven this. My experience as a young man leaving the comforts of home, going, only 2 hours down the road, but changing, a lot about, changing the trajectory of my career. But the huge benefit, Doug, that I probably should have mentioned was, in my opinion, it didn't just change the trajectory of my career, it just made me a nicer, better person. Pretty straightforward. And I'm certainly not perfect, but I'm definitely a more rounded version than I was, naturally, because I'm, older now. But the changes it made to, how my brain works, my internal narrative, how I saw things, how I perceived things, how I was able to, overcome challenges, be resilient. But, there's a lot that comes under being resilient. I've never met anyone that can practice resilience, but I think problem with, resilience being thrown around the whole time is that there's a couple of things that, if you had real clarity, that sit under resilience that actually make a resilient person. So that all, when you consider all that, and I love talking about this type of thing. I love talking about, I suppose the two legs of the business are professional performance, but also the human experience. And I'm a massive believer in that those two things are, a lot more interlinked than, and the respect that both the human experience and the professional performance need combined is really, really important. And that, I suppose, led me to start thinking, what will I do? How will I do it? What's most important to me? My kids, my family, my wife. And I thought, why not try something myself? And, I feel like I've got the intellectual property for it. I've got, the experience in one area. I certainly don't have, I'm certainly lacking a bit of experience in some of the stuff we discussed before recording, the finer details around, the business and organization and a few other things that, are just new to me. But I thought, this direction is something that I really enjoy. I feel like I can get to a world-class level at. I feel like I can get to a world-class level here. And it gives me energy. And it's, that's the exciting part for me.
Lovely. In terms of energy, something obviously you just mentioned there, you talk a lot about the flow state. And actually, McKinsey have done a study, I know, a 10-year study showing that people who are in the flow state are 500% more productive. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, though, that don't quite know what that flow state is. Can you tell us a little bit about what that flow state is and how it could benefit people and how they can learn it?
Yeah, so I think it's different for everyone. Like most things, it's not black and white. It's different. It's felt differently. It's experienced differently. And coming from my background of professional sports, it was a very acute setting. It was a very acute performance setting. And as an ex-athlete, I describe flow as peak performance with effortless ease. So what I mean, obviously, the peak performance, is what it makes sense. But the effortless ease, some people get a bit, misunderstood about what that means. And what effortless ease means to me is that you're so present that it actually just feels different, and time moves at a different pace. Sometimes time slows down to your benefit. Other time, 20 minutes have gone past and you haven't even realized, which is, a very different experience to, when you're not in that particular state. And within this, state that you've engaged in, it just feels easy. The ball bounces to you, your timing is just smooth, your communication is accurate and calm. It just almost overtakes you, and you just got to try and surrender to that and not overthink it then, and just let that happen. And it's an amazing feeling. It really is an amazing feeling because it's so different. Like I said, it feels easy, and it's not easy because to get to that piece, I think that's the piece where I was touching on, that everyone is different. There's intrinsic triggers, there's extrinsic triggers. There we go. And there's group triggers as well. And the triggers that are gonna get you there are likely going to be very different to mine, or even if we have a few overlapping, the ones that connect to get to that top level state are likely going to be different. And that's why the know thyself piece comes in. And experience in sport and in life really is a huge advantage. But like, if you try and unpack it, like, why is it an advantage? What is the advantage to having seen pictures before, being in certain, having had exposure to more moments than someone who's less experienced? I think a lot of it comes down to, it's not necessarily the experience of in a professional sport environment, the match you're in. Of course there is a bit of that, but it's how you got there. Because there's so many challenges to get to Heineken Cup semi-final, or a Six Nations Grand Slam decider. But the route you took there, and how deeply you understood yourself from a personal side, because ultimately, I came from a team sport, but it's the individual performance connected to the team cohesion is what you're looking for. But we have to give the individual performance the respect it deserves within that. And to do that, we have to allow the individuals within a team to get to that event the best way that serves them. I think that's probably where the sport will continually grow in team sports, that we shouldn't just have blanket schedules or gym sessions or pitch sessions. It shouldn't just be, across the board. And it's not, in my experience, with rugby, it's not. But I think the more we can tap into the individuals' needs to get them to bring the best version of themselves once the team need them, I think that's when you're going to see more individuals performing at a level that they maybe haven't performed at, because they've been given the space to do what really works for them.
I love that. And obviously now you've got your own performance consultancy and you're teaching people this. What kind of practices or tools do you teach people to help them get into this flow state, to optimize energy, focus, and mindset?
Very different depending on the person. It really is. I would say for the athletes who are fit and playing on a week-to-week basis, you know, context is everything. So, what's gone on the previous week, what's coming this week, particularly say if one of the lads is performing at like in that flow state, you know, we got to understand what have the triggers been to get him there, but also understand that there's threats now for the following week because of the change in circumstance. Because if you perform at your best and you're a man of the match, and everyone in the streets telling you're amazing, all the clips you're seeing in the video room is you doing great stuff, and you're doing the media writing up about you. Those things are little performance threats. They're not derailers, but if you don't manage them based on knowing who you're working with and what truly makes them tick, then they could be performance derailers. So that's just a bit of an example of, when you're working with people, the huge benefit to working with people who are totally committed is obvious. You get so much data on them, you have so much knowledge on them whenever they're totally transparent, vulnerable, and committed, that you can really unpack. You want to be able to speak to people, you want to be able to know what's going on in people's heads as best as you can, and be the person that has the ability to understand the context that they're dealing with while understanding the person that you're dealing with. And some days you just leave it alone. Sometimes it's actually the right thing to do is, listen, hands off here. You do your thing. I remember even played a game against one of those games where I feel like, because why I bring in the effortless ease is I played against Japan a few years ago and scored a few tries, but I just felt the game, it was just so easy to me, and it was a huge opportunity for me because I've been in starting team with Ireland, I've been out of it, I've been in, I've been out, and I was getting an opportunity here, and we were playing New Zealand the following week, and there was a spot open essentially, but I needed to perform in it. And as I said, scored a few tries, but generally the game, it's probably one of the top games of my career. And Paul O'Connell, as remember, as like it was yesterday, we were getting on the bus under the stadium after. He goes, "Jeez, that was brilliant." And I said, like, my exact words were, "I just found that so easy," And I wasn't saying that it wasn't from a an arrogant way. It was just my experience of the previous couple hours, and that feeling is special, but it's not easily accessed. You got to really understand how to access that, and that's what I think is worth pursuing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love that, and it is so important. You mentioned it is really down to the individual in terms of performance coaching, rather than being able to have just a rack of what's going to happen at the end. In terms of, what were some of the biggest lessons that you came across in professional rugby that directly apply to leaders and teams now in business?
I think the most simple one is you get out what you put in.
Mm.
It's It's not 100% of the time, but it's a fair whack at the time. It really is. There's going to be luck involved. There's going to be timing involved. There's going to be life circumstance involved. But as a general rule, and you could also term that you get what you deserve. And again, I know that that's not a blanket statement, but I think it's something that just why say that? Because we want to all, like, for me, I want to have like 100% accountability and ownership of, what my life is, what it looks like, across the board, not just professionally, personally, health, fitness, all these things. I'm not looking to be perfect in any of them by any stretch, but I think you get out what you put in, it hands you back that accountability. And I think if someone could take anything from, any type of conversation like we're having here now, is that's true. And which is great news to other people and bad news to some people, but it's whatever you make it. The great part about it is that it's actually one of the things that is in your control, that you can apply yourself and make sure your effort is directed in the right way. And if you do that, the chances are high that you'll get somewhere close to where you want to get to.
Yeah, I agree. And also great emotional intelligence, because people won't realize this because I obviously edited this before it went out. But ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you now that I had a power cut here while doing this amazing interview with this great man. And yet he continued like an absolute professional to, while I was gone for about, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes. So that's something that you can definitely bring from past experience into leadership and teams now as well. And based on that, I mean, obviously, teamwork is key, and obviously situations like what we went through is key. How important do you think communication under pressure is, and how can business leaders learn from how sports teams operate in high stakes moments?
Honestly, I don't know exactly,
Hmm.
because professional sport it's a very transparent business, not just for the four walls of the Munster or Ireland or whoever you play with, but you know, everyone has their opinion on, the media drive a lot of the narrative in the country. And people are, listen, people are, the reason why athletes can be athletes in any sport is there's massive levels of interest in it. Or, if there wasn't, there would be no such thing as professional athletes, because it would just be people who enjoy playing sport, playing, in a field, and you might have someone watching who's walking their dog. But that's the beauty of sport. People are so invested in it. Um, and I digress slightly, but I suppose the point is that I come from a background of, like, the communication is direct. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? It's
Yeah.
direct, because if it's not direct, I'm looking at a clip of whether it's myself or someone else who's, it's not about, hanging people for making, um, skill mistakes, but if you're not applying yourself in terms of the effort you're putting in, if you're not concentrating, if you've not done the work in preparation for either a training session or a match, to know your detail, and then you let the guys around you down because of, a lapse in effort, you know, that's unacceptable.
Yeah.
And everyone's done it. This isn't to say that I've never done that, or any of the great coaches I've worked with. We've all done that as players, because we're human beings, but it's not acceptable to do that on repeat. And you quickly find out that it's more uncomfortable to be really well prepared and do all the work in preparation than to be the one who's letting the team down, or missing a role, or clocking off whenever you shouldn't have been in a certain position. That's more uncomfortable than the other side. So you pick your hard, and the hard thing is to prepare right, but it's easier than preparing wrong and not just letting your teammates down, but if you're playing for Ireland, letting a lot of people down.
Yeah. It is hard, obviously, now, because obviously in sport, I totally agree with you. Sometimes you need a bit of a kick up the bum and stuff like that. But then I think in business now, because there's a lot of sensitivity around how people communicate, we do have to be a little bit careful. And obviously with mental health and all that kind of stuff. In terms of mental health, what kind of advice would you give leaders to inspire high performance culture, but making sure there isn't burnout within their teams?
I think, try and arm yourself from burnout. You just want to be really from a, if you look at the individuals that make up a team, you want to give them enough space to be really clear in their own head of, what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think it's not that complicated, but we make it complicated because very few of us have time at the moment to explore ourselves a bit deeper. Very few of us have time at the moment to, a lot of people are in offices from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, and you're going home to kids, and weekends are busy. It's like, give people a bit of time to invest back in themselves. Whether that's keeping physically fit, whether that's them exploring themselves a bit, a bit more, or if it's really important to them to have, a certain level of a certain aspect of social engagement. Find them what actually feel, for want of a better term, finding out what fills their cup back up and giving them the space to do that. I think you'll get that back, in terms of their performance, in terms of their motivation, their consistency, and their engagement. And again, it's the same piece though. It's everyone's different. For me, like at the moment with how busy life is, just having 2 hours on the couch from 8 to 10, is just like my golden time, because you get up in the morning, you've got the kids, dropping them halfway across the town, and you try and, get to the gym. Speaking to you today, got a meeting now after this, got another meeting after that, collect the kids, go, back across town, kids down for the evening, dinners, bedtimes, and all that. And so by the time you're done that, having real clarity on, and listen, for me, it's that kind of few hours, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, football match on, stupid show on Netflix on, that kind of gives me that energy back. For other people, it's, they're going to the gym at that slot, or they're going out for a walk, or they're meeting their brother or sister or mate for a pint in the pub, whatever it is that returns energy to your system. Allow people space to do that, and you'll get it back, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I agree. It is very much down to the individual. I know some people who love going out for a run, love getting out in nature. Other people who do meditation, which you mentioned earlier on, whatever it is to help them ground themselves back into a relaxed state. And I must admit, I do like being on the couch sometimes at 8 till 10 myself.
Yeah,
Looking back at your career, and you've had an amazing career, what would you say you're most proud of?
great question. I'm most proud of what we've already spoke, that I turned it around, you
Mhm.
know, by far. Like, I just, it kind of gives me the thought of, if I didn't, is something that is not that I think of often, but it was a huge moment for me. It was a huge shift, and it was by far and away what I'm most proud of. And then I suppose, being who I thought I was, once I started building, and that the months or the weeks turned to months, the months turned to years, and grinding and grinding to get into, starting 15 for Munster consistently, grinding to get into an Irish squad, grinding to get a cap, then continually pursuing, being a starter for Ireland, trying to be one of the best players, and ultimately performing at my best against New Zealand's and South Africa's and England's and Wales. That gives me a lot of satisfaction, that I didn't just make it there and kind of, was happy to take my cap and, hang around the squad, that I never stopped chasing and pushing myself until I had to stop. That was that, and my performances in the jersey did it justice. That's something that, I'm really, really proud of.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, that would be really useful for anybody out there that maybe is having a tough time in life or want to improve their self and job, performance, life, relationships, health, whatever. I think that would tie really into actually a proven example that you've gone through experience to be able to help other people. And, which is obviously what you're doing in terms of your flow state stuff, which is brilliant. And in terms of legacy, we all talk now these days about legacy and stuff like that. Um, what kind of legacy would you like to leave going forward? If a good way of asking this, I always say, is if I was to put you on stage in front of 10,000 people, beam it out to the 8 billion people around the planet, what would you, and you're 90, say, what legacy speech would you like to leave? Message you'd like to leave, whether it be with your children, your grandchildren, or the world itself?
God, that is a big one. I genuinely, I can't. I suppose it's hard to bring myself to 90 because I'm 33. Um, you know, I think if I could, if I could really chunk it down all the way to its most basic foundational level of, what we're here for is ultimately we're here to have children and give them the required skills, lessons, and experiences to then go out into the world and add value. And the world is changing so much so quickly that it's really, really hard to even picture what the world's going to look like in 20 years with all the goings on and the technological advances. But I suppose, if I chunk it all the way down to that piece, it's like, you know, keep it really simple and, you know, be someone and be a part of a family that, is full of love and, laughter and great experiences and um making sure that, my kids and those closest to me have um have the have the tools, whenever it's time for them to use the tools to go out there and have, amazing lives that, add value to others around them, but also, there is is something that is, you know, is important that, they can go out there. So I don't know. It's a hard one because I think for me, the way I think is, you can zoom out and you can try and look that far ahead. And I do that sometimes, but not to 90. Um, but I kind of tend to work off I zoom in and I attack the day that's in front of me in the best way I know how to. And, of course, as you get older, you start thinking about different things. But I think the best way for me to do it is, be where you are today and keep moving forward in the direction you think is worthwhile.
Yeah, 100% agree. I always say the past is history, the future is a mystery, the present is a gift. So live in the now. And you can't really do anything about planning for the future in the future. You can only do it in the now. So I love that. Andrew, one last question, and it's a selfish one for me actually, because I know that you are massively into personal development and performance. I'd love to know, because I know you're very well read. What would you say is like being one of your best, most inspirational books that you've read that you would recommend to people?
There's a few, like there's the self-development style ones. I've read a few unbelievably good biographies or autobiographies that I love. I heard a great thing years ago. It was actually an old colleague of mine. Well, not really colleague. He worked, Andy McNulty, who worked with the IRFU, and I have a lot of time for. And he was on a podcast years ago. This is now before podcasts were even a thing. Really, this is 10 years ago, and the host asked him, something came up about being the average of the five people that you spend the most time with. That kind of theory, which I
Yep.
think is not far wrong. And the host said, but what happens if, someone believes that, but they don't have, people that they want to mold themselves around them? And then his answer was genius. He just said, well, in this day and age, we've got so many books, we've got podcasts, we've got, the internet. You don't have to mold yourself around one individual from history, but you can, if you spend time reading, listening, consistently, that the people that you're reading and listening to about, they're entering your consciousness, one little decimal point at a time. And I just thought that was a really good way to frame it, because it made it really accessible for people. And, to go back to your question, like maybe a small bit different, but someone like Andy Lee, Andy Lee, the boxer, I've read his book 3 times. And for whatever reason, it just spoke to me. Really inspirational story. And he's also, from Limerick, met him a few times. He's now on the world stage, coaching Tyson Fury and Joseph Parker. And he seems like he's going to go on to do brilliant things. Lot like Muhammad Ali, massive, like Muhammad Ali's my, sporting hero alongside Roy Keane. So I've read all the biographies about Muhammad Ali, his autobiography, Joe Frazier. I like the kind of the fighting ones, the boxers in particular, like the historical boxers, Tyson, who else? A few others. And then probably from a self-development point of view, there's a book called As a Man Thinketh. It's kind of short little handbook style. It's written in Old English, like the title, and it really is just explaining how our thoughts are governing our experience, and our experience is governing our life. Pretty simple, but it's really digestible, and it's straightforward. And it's small. I think one of the things that I'd criticize of, I thought Atomic Habits was a really good book, but it's too long. You know what I mean? It's like you could shorten that down to 20% of what it is, and you get the exact same value from it. But you're not. And listen, I'm not in the publishing industry, so who am I to say what models they go up? But as a reader's experience, someone who's read, and sorry, the last book is 7 Spiritual Laws of Success by Deepak Chopra. I think that's a really good book. I think there's truth to that.
Yeah.
And they're like those last 2 books, As a Man Thinketh and 7 Spiritual Laws. They're punchy. There's no fat on them. There's no wastage, or they're quite clearly, like, every word is accounted for. So anyway, that's just a little opinion on some of the wastage because when you're reading a book, you're like, this is class, but then you spend 7 nights in a row and you're just reading the same thing. You're like, it's kind of wasted, a bit of time there. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the publishing world. But I think the book, like books and podcasts and the access that we have now these days, and sometimes it's almost too accessible for people, because you can go on, if you really want to, you can actually learn so much about history and people in the past, and what's worked for them and what hasn't, and try and figure the trends out. But also you need to see the value in it, because ultimately that's talk about decision making and understanding habits and behaviors. If you understand where your values go, then you can understand why you're making decisions. And I absolutely value listening to inspirational and motivational people who I respect, and trying to pick up things from them bit by bit.
Totally agree with you. That's why I do the podcast. That's why I interview amazing people like you. So, and on that, we've actually run out of time. And I have to say, Andrew, I'm really, really grateful. I've listened to a few of your podcasts, and I have to say the energy you put into this was absolutely fantastic. I'm so grateful. And I wish you every success going forward.
Thank you, Doug. No, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise. My name's Doug Gordon, and you've been listening to Andrew Conway on Inspirational People, Inspirational Stories. I'll be back next week with another inspirational guest. In the meantime, if you need to get in touch, please contact me at doug@dougdgordon.com. From all of us here in the team of the show, I wish you a truly inspirational week and look forward to speaking to you next time. Bye for now.